Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're really digging into something specific, something that, well, I think resonates with a lot of Nigerians how we talk, about ourselves, about the nation.
Yeah, absolutely. We're looking at this fascinating episode from the Nigerian Ecosystem podcast. It's called The Bridge Must Hold, Kings Without Kingdoms.
Right. And it really tackles this core question, doesn't it? Why is there this tendency sometimes to speak so grandly like kings as they put it?
Like kings, like prophets even.
Yeah.
But then you look around and the actual development, the action, it doesn't always match up. There's a gap.
Exactly. That's the gap we want to explore. What's behind that? We're drawing on this podcast episode to, try and understand these contradictions you see, both in Nigeria and for Nigerians abroad.
Sort of getting under the skin of that space between the big talk and the reality on the ground, and maybe see if there are pathways forward suggested.
Yeah. And the podcast itself, it just grabs you from the start, that opening line.
Oh, it's powerful. There's a way we Nigerians talk, like kings, like prophets. We speak of kingdoms we've never built and criticize nations we never planned to fix.
Wow. It's hard, right? It sets this immediate tone. It's not pulling any punches.
Not at all. And it throws that contrast right out there.
Right.
The idea of dreaming up empires in the metaverse.
Right. While maybe struggling with basic things like reliable electricity, it's a jarring image.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it makes you think about this idea of being kings in our heads, but maybe lacking some of that foundational knowledge, governance, economics, the nuts and
That
bolts.
practical stuff. And it also touches on the diaspora, that feeling we left, but we never let go, which is so true for many.
Yeah, that connection remains strong. The podcast talks about exploring the space between memory and mission for everyone, home and away. That's a really interesting frame.
Okay, so let's start there with the language itself, the metaphors.
This tendency the podcast points out, using really powerful, almost regal language, sounding powerful in broken places.
Where does that come from, do you think? Is it hope? Is it something else?
Could be hope, definitely. A kind of resilience, maybe. But the podcast gives these really sharp examples, like talking digital empires while dealing with power cuts.
Or claiming intellectual thrones on WhatsApp, like that online influence is the same as actual statecraft.
Exactly. And the big declarations, we'll take over the metaverse, or we are kings in our space. Sounds impressive.
It does. But the critique in the source is that this grand talk often doesn't come with the follow-through. The actual hard graft of building systems, teams, missions that need real sacrifice.
Right. The commitment. It makes you ask, like the podcast hints, are these metaphors real dreams pushing us forward?
Hmm.
Or maybe a way to sidestep the tough work? A bit of avoidance.
Avoidance. That's a tough thought. And it links to that quote. We believe in being kings, but we hate what it takes to build a kingdom. Order, structure, sacrifice, sweat.
Oof. Yeah. That lands heavily. Hating what it takes. Why that aversion, do you think? Is it impatience? Wanting the kingdom without the kingdom building part?
Maybe. Or maybe, like you touched on earlier, not enough focus on the how, the incremental steps, the unglamorous but essential stuff.
Could be. It's like wanting the finished painting without learning how to mix the colors or prep the canvas.
Yeah, exactly. Which kind of leads us into the next bit. The podcast explores this idea of critics without calluses.
Yes. This is where it looks at how people sometimes move up in structures. Could be student unions, could be state parliaments.
Yeah.
But it's based on, rotation, whose turn it is.
Not necessarily on vision or competence or having actually achieved something concrete.
That's the implication. It's more about the system, the cue, rather than fresh ideas or proven ability.
And the result, the podcast argues, is stagnation, a lack of fresh eyes and fresh fire.
Pretty much. It calls it an assembly line of recycled power. The same thinking, maybe the same limitations, just gets passed along.
Yeah. Wow. And tied into this is that reluctance to say, I don't know, that pressure to always seem like you have the answers.
Right. But the podcast suggests something revolutionary in admitting ignorance and saying, okay, I don't know how this works, but I'm willing to learn. That vulnerability.
Why is that so hard, do you think? Is it seen as weakness? Losing face?
Probably. Cultural norms around leadership, maybe.
Yeah.
But, as the source argues, that willingness to learn is absolutely key. It's fundamental for any real progress.
Which brings us back to the critics without calluses. Let's unpack that phrase. What does it really mean in this context?
It paints this picture, doesn't it? People who are very, very opinionated, quick to criticize, point out every flaw.
Very vocal.
Very vocal. But they aren't actually in the arena. They're not involved in the messy work of trying to fix things or build something better. They're watching from the sidelines and booing the players, as the episode puts it.
So strong opinions, but no skin in the game. No calluses from the actual labor. Like you said, judging the marathon runner without ever running a mile yourself.
Precisely. And the podcast is blunt here. Your criticism has no weight if your hands are clean of labor.
Clean hands have no weight. That's powerful. It suggests legitimacy comes from doing, from trying, from getting involved.
Absolutely. It links critique to action. Why do you think people fall into that pattern, though? Is it lack of opportunity, feeling powerless, or is it just easier to comment?
Could be all of those. Maybe it feels safer to critique than to risk failing by trying, which leads us neatly into the next segment's idea. Empire requires humility.
Yes. Moving beyond just the talk. This tackles what the podcast calls false mastery.
False mastery. Believing you're an expert when maybe you're not quite there yet.
Exactly. And that belief, that conviction you already know it all, it just shuts down learning. It blocks progress. There's no room for anything new if you think you're already the master.
And it connects us to another crucial point, the importance of followership. That leading well often means knowing how to follow well first. They're connected.
Deeply connected. Not opposites at all. But maybe sometimes there's too much emphasis on just being the boss, without valuing being a really good, committed part of the team.
Is that where the crab mentality comes in? The podcast mentions that.
Yeah, it links it directly. But interestingly, it frames it not just as malice, but as something born out of fear and insecurity. Seeing someone else succeed highlights your own inaction, perhaps.
So instead of being inspired, the reaction is to pull them back down, to level the playing field by dragging others down, rather than lifting yourself up.
That seems to be the dynamic described. It's a defense mechanism against feeling inadequate, maybe.
So what's the solution proposed? How do we counter that?
A cultural shift. That's what the podcast argues for. Moving toward valuing the process of learning, embracing humility, making it okay, even sacred, as they say, to admit, I'm still learning.
Instead of it being shameful. So vulnerability is a strength, really, a sign of growth.
Exactly, and it clarifies something important. You're not excluded from contributing just because you don't know something yet.
Right. It's not about having all the answers up front.
No. The disqualifier, the real barrier, is the refusal to learn. That's the key quote. You're not disqualified from the ecosystem because you don't know something. You're disqualified when you refuse to learn.
It really puts the focus on attitude, on mindset. The willingness to grow is what counts. Okay, so wrapping things up, let's go back to that title image. The bridge must hold.
Such a strong closing metaphor. The podcast repeats it. The bridge must hold, not because it is easy, but because it is the only way across.
It speaks to necessity, doesn't it? And acknowledges the difficulty. This isn't going to be simple.
Not at all. And then there's that direct address to the Nigerian diaspora, reframing their position.
Yeah, calling them warriors in disguise. Not just guests in other countries, but people with a role to play back home.
And the call isn't necessarily to physically return to live, but to lead, to bring back that knowledge, that experience. It's a powerful charge.
There's a definite urgency there. The bridge must hold. It feels critical, like a call to collective responsibility.
And it tries to make it practical, urging people to move from metaphor to mission, to actually do something, like the suggestion to build yourself, find your group, your project.
And let your voice grow hands. Make your input tangible. Make it count in the real world. It's about action, not just talk.
Moving beyond the applause. The podcast explicitly says it near the end, connecting to its overall theme.
Right. Truth, unity, action. That's the series tagline.
And it concludes, this is not a podcast for applause, it is a blueprint for survival.
A blueprint for survival, framing it as essential, practical, not just ideas, but tools for building that bridge.
Yeah.
So as we finish this deep dive reflecting on the bridge must hold, the question lingers, doesn't it?
For you, the listener, what does building that bridge actually look like? And what part will you play in making sure it holds strong?